Okay, now we turn our attention to the book of Romans. Romans has been called Paul's magnum opus. Paul had hoped to go west, which is probably specifically Spain, which was part of the western frontier of the Roman Empire. It was a place he hadn't gone yet, and as you know, Paul always wanted to bring the gospel to places that he had never been, and he had traveled much of the Roman world already, and so there was a desire and an interest in bringing the gospel further west. He'd never been to Rome, um, but he wanted to go there, and he wanted to stop there first, and then go on from there to Spain. Romans is the first book that's listed of Paul's in the New Testament. And the question is sometimes asked, why is Romans first? And the answer is that Romans is actually the longest of Paul's letters. And so by putting it first, it was a way of sort of helping the reader understand what Paul's thoughts were. How did Paul know about the Roman church? Well, he had certainly met people from the church while at Corinth. Some of them had been expelled under an edict that had kicked Jews out of Rome, like Priscilla and Aquila. And he had met them and knew about them and knew about the reputation of the church. So, what was Rome like? Well, one of the things we know, just from watching movies about Rome, is that it was very famous for its gladiatorial sport. Already in 73 BC, 100 years before the crucifixion of Jesus, there was a famous gladiator named Spartacus. He's one of the most famous Roman gladiators ever. And he escaped a gladiatorial school and organized a violent slave revolt that literally threatened to overthrow the Roman Republic. His throng of runaway slaves defeat three different Roman armies on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. Uh, this story is just one of many that's been made into movies, and it's part of Roman life to realize that Rome was a city of gladiatorial sport and many, many other things. Rome was a city that would have been astonishing to have visited. It was filled with aqueducts and public latrines, sewers and baths. Its multi-storied buildings had indoor plumbing. It had police and fire departments, buildings, libraries, race courses, theaters, and architecture that was virtually unrivaled. It was also the capital, of course, of the Mediterranean world for about 200 years. And part of what made Rome so spectacular were the Roman roads. The old saying is that all roads lead to Rome. And what really made it accessible were these thousands of miles of roads that stretched across the empire that led back to Rome. It had medical colleges and, of course, as I said, gladiatorial events. And it was a city that had as many as 1 million people living in it. One of the questions that comes up about Roman life was it religious? And actually, religion was central to the political and social life of the city of Rome. Priests counseled the Senate on war and law. And it wasn't just a place of one religion or two religions or a few religions, but it was a place of many religions or pluralistic religion. There was essentially a pantheon of different gods and goddesses that were worshipped. In fact, Rome took religion so importantly, took it so seriously that any desecration of a temple was considered a capital offense. Now, part of the problem for Jews and Christians was that they believed that they were the only religion that was right, and this often put them at odds with the Romans. But still, the Romans had built into their value system a respect for other religions, and so this created a bit of a problem for the Romans. This is the temple of Romulus, the legendary founder of the first king of Rome. When we think about a little bit about the setting of Rome as Paul writes the letter, we need to ask some questions like, why did Paul really want to go west? And in a sense, the answer is that Paul had spent many years now crisscrossing the part of the Roman Empire that he'd already been to. He'd been all over Greece, he'd been all over Asia Minor, he'd been, to Israel. And so where else would he go? Where else could he go to bring the gospel? And the plan, of course, was to go west, to go toward Spain. Spain was on the western end of the world. In some cases, it was sort of seen as going to the end of the world. Now, when Paul writes this letter to the Romans, he was in Corinth. And we know that because of what it says in Romans and Corinthians both. In both places, we're told that Paul was being hosted by a man named Gaius. Gaius was from Corinth. Romans 16:23 tells us that. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 14 mentions also Phoebe of Cenchrea, who is then also mentioned again in chapter 16 of Romans as apparently the one who delivers the letter to Rome. Again, Cenchrea was a port city there of Corinth. So it seems to be very strong indications that Paul was in Corinth when he wrote the letter. It was probably written at the end of the third missionary journey, again in Corinth. And the famine relief fund, always an issue in Paul's mind. He probably had in mind to bring the money from this fund to Judea. And then from there, he would eventually be brought to Rome under arrest. The Church of Romans. What was the Roman church like? It's estimated that about 50,000 Jews lived in Rome by the 1st century BC. This was probably in part after Pompey in 63 BC conquered Jerusalem and brought back with him to Rome a number of slaves. Archaeologists have discovered a number of synagogues, nearly a dozen so far have been found. And there's always a question about, how did the church start there in Rome? And the answer is we don't know, but we do know that there were a lot of Christians, or I should say there were a lot of Jews in Jerusalem for Pentecost who could have brought the message back. Now, during the reign of the man you see who pictured here, Claudius, in the year 49 AD, there was an edict that he issued that kicked the Jews out of Rome. And among those was Priscilla and Aquila, mentioned in Acts 18, 1 through 2. And this expelling of Jews would actually, ironically, be helpful in the expansion of Christianity, because the Jews who were forced to leave Rome would then hear about the gospel and then bring the gospel back when they returned. Now, one of the questions that we ask is what happened to the synagogue or the church if all the Jews left? And it's an interesting question, and the answer is it largely became a Gentile church. So by the time Paul writes Romans and the Jews are now back in the churches, there's this sort of interesting struggle for identity. Is it the Jews' church or the Gentiles' church? And after all, they're meeting in Jewish synagogues anyway. And so all of this would have had an impact on the writing of Romans. And that's one of the questions that we ask is, why did Paul write the book of Romans? There's several reasons that he probably did so. One was he wanted to have an anchor church, which is to say he wanted to have a church in the West that could be helpful to him in his expansion of the church further westward. On all of his previous missionary work, the church in Syrian Antioch had been that anchor church for him. Also, Romans was an attempt to sort of establish some rapport and build a good relationship with the church. And undoubtedly, he spends a lot of time trying to explain his own theology, because there was probably some misunderstandings about what Paul believed, and he wanted to clear those up. But there also is evidence in the letter that he has some concern, some pastoral concern, that there's kind of a debate or an issue, the Jews and the Gentiles, and sort of who's more important, and how do we fit Gentiles into the Jewish church? How do we fit Jews into the church period? How does all of this connect and work? And Romans deals with those issues. Very few question the authorship of the letter by Paul, but one of the interesting things that the letter tells us is Paul didn't write the full thing. In fact, we're told that a man named Tertius wrote it down for Paul. He is what we call an amanuensis, a writing secretary, and we're told something about him in the letter. Now, there is also at dispute by some discussion about the literary unity of the letter. You can see more about this matter in the book, and also to see what the answer is. It's a fairly complicated question, and it's sort of a lesser themed significance, but the issue can be pretty easily resolved by just a quick understanding of the manuscript evidence associated with it. Now, the literary form of Romans, it's divided into some obvious literary divisions that are signaled by some literary devices and grammatical features. The letter fits the ancient fashion and has some of the features of what's called a diatribe. You can see the sidebar in the book on diatribe. Also take a look at the codex section. And a diatribe, you can see, is a kind of way of writing, and particularly it'll ask a question, a rhetorical question, and assume the answer is no. And again, do notice the sidebar on codex, because one of the things that's very interesting about early Christianity is it seems that Christians really did invent the book. Prior to the writing of the New Testament, things were done in scrolls, but the Bible has to be put together in the form of a book, and so it seems that the Bible actually creates the book. A basic outline of Romans is salutation, theological explanation, ethical exhortation, and conclusion. Now, the book deals with a series of theological arguments in the salutation and introduction that sets the tone. We're told about the grace and peace of God, and there's an effort to build some rapport with the church. And also, Paul talks about his apostolic calling. The thesis of the book of Romans is Romans 1:16. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God for the salvation of everyone believes, first for the Jew and then the Gentile. For in it a righteousness is revealed that is by faith from first to last. And that becomes the big theme of the whole book, is how to understand God's righteousness. Now, Paul in chapters 1 through 11 gives a theological explanation of the gospel. in terms of the human dilemma of sin and guilt. What is that human condition? Again, it's sin, the sin of Gentiles, the sin of Jews, the sin of all humanity, the wrath of God that's poured out, human rebellion. The result is misdirected sex, the worship of idols, the ethical breakdown in the fabric of society. Again, God's wrath is poured out because of human sin and a rebellion against God as God. That's the problem. The solution is justification. The sacrificial death of Jesus brings about justification. Jesus plays the crucial part in this by being the sacrifice for us. And people are justified by putting their faith in Jesus, both Jews and Gentiles, for what he did. And this is what's so significant about Abraham as an example of this. The results of this justification include peace and grace that transforms character and hope in the face of human suffering. Now, when Paul describes this work of Jesus, he uses the Greek word hilasterion, which means expiation or propitiation. Jesus is the satisfying sacrifice to God on our behalf. The next several chapters in Romans 6 through 8 deal with the Christian prospect of sanctification. So God offers, real restoration, freedom from condemnation, and escape from moral paralysis. The results are freedom. We have the freedom to do what we want under sin. We have that freedom to do what we want under sin, but we don't have that freedom to do what we ought. But through Christ's sanctifying work, through the sanctifying work of the Spirit, we can now really be holy. We can be like God and experience eternal life. Paul uses a variety of metaphors, including slavery and also the metaphor of marriage. He'll use this very interesting image of the olive tree in the next section in Romans 9 through 11, and talk about the olive tree and being cut off and being grafted in. And he'll use this as an image of describing how Gentiles become a part of the people of God. Chapters 9 through 11 lay out God's plan for Israel. They explain his rejection of Israel and his restoration. He answers the question, what about those who reject the Messiah? And deals with the fact that since Jews did not accept the Messiah, but Gentiles did, had God failed? And deals with the question of what about what is the remnant? Who are the people of God that God has always had? And it's interesting because he then uses that olive branch and broken branch imagery to talk about how the olive tree, how grafted in are these branches that were broken off, as a way of describing Gentiles being brought into the church, but also Jews being reunited with God. One of the questions that also comes up, the book deals with, is what we call Zionism, which is sort of the celebration of Israeli nationalism today, and the question of what purpose does God still have for the Jews? There's huge political and sort of societal and sometimes even personal issues in trying to answer that specific question. Chapters 12 through 15 deal with the ethical exhortation, the practical implications of the gospel. We learn that right thinking and believing produces right living. You can see a sidebar on that. What are the 4 areas of ethics that become affected in this area? Community ethics, political ethics, personal ethics, and then what Paul calls the strong and the weak. What's necessary for for ethics to work, no system of ethics is successful without moral and spiritual transformation. Paul talks about having the mind of Christ and being transformed in our mind and having the right way of thinking and understanding. And then how can a Christian community exist with diversity? How do Christians live in a community? Should we become isolated from the world, or should we become insulated from the world? Or should we become engaged in the world or disengaged from the world? Or should we become social justice warriors? These are questions that we all ask, and Paul deals with these questions about sort of spiritual and social and practical engagement with the world. The westward expansion of the Roman Empire is evidenced by this picture here from Spain of a Roman-built bridge. The Romans had occupied southern Spain from the 2nd century BC, but Augustus completed its conquest in about 26 to 19 BC. This Roman bridge was made with such precision it needed no mortar, and it was built in AD 106. It's found in Alcantara, Spain. Alcantara is Arabic for bridge. All right, so just to kind of wrap it up here on Romans, we see in Romans Paul's Gentile ministry. He lays out some of the reasons for his writing, his future travel plans. He talks about, at the end of the book of Romans, a recommendation that he gives to Phoebe, who brings the letter, and explains some of his reasons for wanting to write the letter as it relates to his plan to go west, build an anchor church, deal with the pastoral issues, and also his future travel plans. Phoebe and the other women that are mentioned at the end of Romans in chapter 16, we're reminded that 20% of Paul's co-workers were women, including a female apostle. So Paul had no problem including women in with the ministry that he did in the church. The central theme of Romans, real quickly, in the post-Reformation era, the central theme has been personal justification. There has been, since a writing by a man named Christopher Stendahl in 1963, what has been called the New Perspective on Paul, which focuses on the idea that Romans is not so much about personal justification as it is about how to understand the Gentiles being brought into the church. It raises the question, what is really the gospel? What is the good news that Paul is talking about in Romans 1:16? Luther famously thought of the good news as, well, the law won't save you and works won't get you there, but Jesus by faith and grace will get you there. And that's the way we sometimes simplify and summarize the gospel, but that sort of truncated version of the gospel kind of misses what Paul, the big picture that Paul's trying to paint for us in the book of Romans, which was written to address the issues of the church at Rome and the relationship of Jews and Gentiles together. Works of the law, for example, probably is the religious efforts of Jews to secure their place with God through Jewish identity markers like circumcision and kosher food. But the gospel is the main theme, and the Jew-Gentile problem is putting the gospel in jeopardy. At the heart of this whole thing is if we do not recognize the new work of God in Christ, if we continue to pursue the law and a renewed community made up of Jews and Gentiles, a new Israel, becomes impossible.